The sky over Mongolia was always vast, like an ocean turned upside down, blue and endless, but hiding something wild beneath. The land beneath it was harsh and empty. No marble cities, no gardens, no temples, only wind, grass, and the ghosts of forgotten tribes. From that emptiness came the man the world would remember as Genghis Khan, the storm that broke empires. He was not born to kingship. His name was Temujin, a boy whose world was torn apart before he could walk. His father, Yesugei, was poisoned by rival tribes, and his family was cast out into the cold. They lived by scavenging roots, by eating small animals, by stealing what they could from the wilderness. Hunger carved him, loneliness hardened him, and vengeance became his only companion. When his mother looked at him, she saw not a child, but something waiting to awaken. As he grew, Temujin learned that in the steppe, mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Betrayal was common as the wind, and strength was the only currency that lasted. He fought his way from nothing, from a fugitive boy to a warlord who united the tribes of the Mongols under one iron command. Each tribe that refused to kneel was wiped out. Those who swore loyalty were given a share in his destiny. He replaced chaos with obedience, tradition with discipline, and superstition with strategy. When Temujin became Genghis Khan, universal ruler, the world changed shape. His army was unlike any other, born from hardship, trained by necessity. Every man could ride for days without stopping. They carried dried meat under their saddles, drank the blood of their horses when water ran out, and could disappear into the horizon faster than any army could follow. Their bows could pierce armor from a distance, and their minds were sharpened by endless discipline. They were not soldiers. They were nature itself, moving as one. And once united, they began to expand. The first targets were the kingdoms of China, and then the great empire of Khwarizm to the west, a realm of wealth and arrogance, ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad. The Mongols approached peacefully, sending a caravan of merchants under their protection. But the Shah, suspicious of their motives, ordered the merchants executed. Their beards were torn out, their goods confiscated, and their bodies dumped into the desert. When Genghis Khan demanded justice, the Shah responded by killing his envoys too. The steppe had seen blood before, but this insult was different. The Khan's wrath was cold and precise, not rage but calculation. He gathered his generals and sons and swore an oath before the eternal sky that he would bring the Khwarizm Empire to its knees. His words were simple: "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." In 1219, the Mongol army began its march westward. They crossed the deserts of Central Asia like ghosts, splitting into multiple columns, moving faster than any scout could report. City after city fell: Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand. The people who resisted were exterminated, their cities burned, their skulls piled into pyramids. Those who surrendered were spared for a time, but even mercy under the Khan was temporary. By 1221, only a few strongholds remained. Among them was Nishapur, a jewel of Persia, a city of poets, scholars, and craftsmen. Its towers glittered in the sun, its markets hummed with life, its walls seemed unbreakable. But that year, the people of Nishapur made a choice that sealed their fate forever. The Mongols had placed the city under siege, and during the fighting, Togachar, Genghis Khan's beloved son-in-law, was killed, struck down by an arrow fired from the walls. When word of his death reached Genghis Khan's daughter, she demanded retribution so complete that not even the memory of Nishapur would remain. The Khan did not argue. He simply nodded. From that moment, Nishapur's doom was written. The Mongol horde began to encircle the city like a tightening noose. The sky grew darker each day, with the smoke of burning villages nearby. Refugees stumbled into the city, whispering tales of what the Mongols had done elsewhere. Rivers choked with bodies, cities turned to dust, fields salted so nothing could grow again. The people of Nishapur prayed. The imams called for jihad. The craftsmen forged weapons instead of jewelry. Mothers hid their children in cellars. But when the first Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon, riding silently with banners of black horsehair fluttering in the wind, every heart in Nishapur knew the storm had arrived. They came in endless waves, tens of thousands of horsemen, their armor reflecting the pale sun, their faces unreadable. They spoke little. They surrounded the city, cutting off every road, every well, every hope of escape. The siege had begun, and when the first arrow fell from the sky, it sounded like the beginning of the end. The first arrow struck a rooftop, then another. Within moments, the sky above Nishapur was blackened with Mongol shafts. They fell in waves, a whispering rain of death. The citizens looked up and saw the sun vanish behind them. From the towers, defenders fired back desperately, but their arrows fell short, clattering harmlessly against distant shields. The Mongols had encircled the city perfectly, an iron ring of cavalry and siege engines stretching beyond sight. Inside the walls, panic spread. Merchants abandoned their stalls, mosques filled with the sound of prayers, and the governor of the city, desperate to maintain order, ordered the gates sealed. He told his soldiers that the Persians of old had stood against Alexander, that Nishapur's walls had never fallen. But the men listening had heard stories of Bukhara, where the Mongols had slaughtered everyone who resisted, of Samarkand, where entire populations were marched out and executed in fields. Hope was a luxury few could still believe in. Beyond the walls, the Mongols began their preparations. They didn't shout. They didn't boast. They moved like engineers building a machine of death. They constructed siege towers, catapults, and trebuchets, thousands of men working in silence. Prisoners captured from nearby villages were forced to carry wood and stone, building the very engines that would destroy their own kind. At night, the Mongols' campfires stretched across the horizon like a second constellation. The people on the walls stared at them and felt their courage bleed away. Then came the drums. The sound was low at first, a single thud that echoed through the night air. Then another, and another. The rhythm built until it became a heartbeat. Slow, steady, merciless. The defenders waited for dawn, but dawn brought no mercy. As the first light touched the walls, the Mongols began to advance. They came in formations that moved with mechanical precision. Rows of archers, lines of cavalry, and behind them, the massive siege engines creaking forward. The air filled with smoke as flaming projectiles were launched over the walls, crashing into rooftops, setting entire streets ablaze. The heat and panic spread faster than the flames. People screamed for water, for air, for escape, but there was nowhere to run. The Mongols never wasted arrows. Each shot found a mark. They aimed for commanders, archers, anyone who looked capable of resistance. Within hours, the defenders were thinning. When a section of wall cracked under the pressure of the trebuchets, the Mongols didn't rush. They waited, patient as wolves circling a wounded animal. They wanted fear to ripen before they struck. Inside the city, chaos turned to despair. The governor sent messengers to negotiate. The Mongols received them politely, and then executed them in front of the walls. Their heads were catapulted back into the city as a message. There would be no peace. That night, the wind shifted. The Mongols began firing pots of burning oil and pitch. Fire spread across the city like a living creature, devouring everything in its path. Smoke filled the streets. The cries of the dying echoed through the alleys. Families huddled in basements, clutching each other, whispering prayers to a god that seemed far away. Above them, the Mongols' engines continued their work, pounding the walls until dawn. By the third day, the defenders could no longer hold. The breaches were too wide, the casualties too great. When the Mongols charged, they came like a flood. Horsemen pouring through the broken gates, their banners snapping in the wind, their blades drawn. The streets of Nishapur became rivers of motion and blood. And as the fighting began, somewhere in the Mongol ranks, a woman watched from afar, Genghis Khan's daughter, Kokochin, the widow of Togachar. Her face was calm, her eyes hollow. She had come to see vengeance with her own eyes. They poured through the gaps like water forced through stone. First came the vanguard, horse archers who rode with their knees and loosed arrows at a full gallop, cutting down anyone who dared to stand in the open streets. Behind them marched the heavy elements, men with hooked blades to drag shields away, men with axes for doors and ribs, men with coils of rope to pull down what the trebuchets had cracked. The sound of the city changed. No longer the distant thud of engines. Now it was close and intimate, boots slapping mud, metal scraping brick, the clipped breathing of men climbing, falling, rising, and pushing forward again. At the main breach, the defenders tried to form a wall of shields. It held for a heartbeat. Then two Mongol teams rushed with mantlets and set them like teeth, creating blind angles from which archers could rake the line. Arrows struck at armpits, throats, the gaps at the cheek. The shield wall collapsed inward as bodies sagged. A Mongol standard went up, black horsehair whipping in the smoke. The cheer that followed was not joyous. It was hard, cold, final. On the northern gate, where the hinges had been burnt and the bar shattered, a wedge of riders pushed in tight formation. They didn't chase, they cut. Each man took the target in front of him and moved on. No waste, no flourish. A boy, trying to pull his father into a doorway, was caught by the back of his robe. The fabric tore, and the boy vanished into a stampede of hooves. The father stood motionless for a moment, as if a wave had passed through him. Then he sank to his knees and covered his head, waiting for the next blow that did not need to come. Fires multiplied. In the bazaar district, a rolling ball of pitch ignited the awnings. Silk and cotton went up in a blossom of heat that curled the signs and made the painted letters run like tears. Pigeons exploded from the rooftops and wheeled in a grey spiral, circling the minaret until smoke swallowed them. The imam, who had called for courage that morning, stumbled down the steps, coughing, his voice shredded by ash. He tried to repeat a line of scripture and found nothing but air. Resistance turned feral. At Shaka Gate, a knot of craftsmen fought with chisels and hammers, faces blackened, sleeves tied at the elbow. They ambushed a file of Mongols turning a corner and dragged two down. For a moment the alley was a whirl of limbs and iron. Then a horn sounded, and riders sealed both ends. The craftsmen disappeared beneath a tide of boots. Their tools lay glinting in the dust like fallen teeth. In the chaos, the rumor spread. The widow was here. A woman of the steppe, wrapped in silence and hard cloth, watching from a rise beyond the southern wall. Some said her eyes never moved. Some said she whispered to the wind. Most said nothing, because the breath they needed for speech belonged to survival. But the name of her dead husband, Togachar, passed from mouth to mouth like a spark, and with it the understanding that this was not merely conquest. It was a debt being collected. Near the Potter's Quarter, the Mongols used a tactic that had broken cities from China to Transoxiana. Prisoners and deserters were driven ahead with ladders and bundles, human shields soaked in fear. Defenders hesitated, one heartbeat, two, and that was enough. Arrows hissed over the captives and found the men behind the parapet. A captain shouted to hold the line. A shaft took him in the eye. The parapet emptied and the ladders rose. By afternoon, the streets had become funnels of death. The Mongols mapped the city as they moved, sending messengers in relays to mark cleared lanes with chalk and blood. Courtyard by courtyard, they erased pockets of resistance, never lingering, always pressing toward the citadel. From the highest tower, the governor watched the pattern close, like fingers. He called for his personal guard to mount. No one answered. In the corner, a brazier sputtered. The ashes of sealed letters blew across the tiles like winter dust. At the western breach, a last stand formed around a broken cart and two fallen beams. Men knelt in staggered ranks and tried to fire in volleys, but the smoke blew sideways, and the lines dissolved. A boy no older than 16 stood bareheaded, sleeve ripped, reciting the names of his brothers, as if the sound alone could hold the street. A rider saw him and reined in. There was a pause, an almost ritual stillness. Then the horse moved forward again, and the names ended. Dusk slid over Nishapur like a lid. The flames showed their true color now, an orange that ate the edges of the world. The air turned thick and bitter. Every breath scraped the throat. Somewhere a bell was ringing without rhythm, struck by falling debris or a hand that no longer knew it was moving. Dogs howled behind closed courtyards. A baby cried and then did not. By night, the citadel gates were battered, chained, then battered again. The great door bowed, splintered, and finally groaned open enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. They did not squeeze. They tore it wide and went in shoulder to shoulder. The last defenders fought on a stair, slipping in their own footprints. A general of the Mongols ordered the drums stopped. The silence that followed was a pressure, a weight that made the rooms seem smaller and the men within them less than shadows. Down in the square, the standards had already been set. A scribe made quick marks on a tablet, recording the hour the city fell. In the dark beyond the wall, the widow lifted her chin a fraction, as if acknowledging a line finally crossed. The gates of Nishapur, once reputed unbreakable, stood ajar, breathing fire and smoke. The city had not merely been taken, it had been opened like a body presented for judgment. The riders formed cordons. The kettle drums sounded once more. 3 slow beats, a verdict entering the bones of the conquered. The next phase would not be battle, it would be arithmetic. When dawn came, it looked wrong. The light was red before it even touched the roofs. Smoke rose from every district in slow, vertical streams, turning the morning sun into a dull copper disk. The smell was no longer wood or oil. It was meat, hair, fabric, and lime from broken walls. The Mongols moved through the ruins methodically, faces wrapped in cloth, horses picking their way through rubble and corpses. No shouting, no celebration, only orders given in short syllables, as if the city itself were a task still unfinished. The Khan's daughter rode through the southern gate. Her escort parted around her like water around stone. She looked neither left nor right. Where the gate's timbers had split, her horse's hooves crushed blackened arrows into powder. A captain dismounted, bowed, and waited for her command. She said nothing. Instead, she turned her horse toward the citadel and raised one gloved hand. That was all it took. Trumpets blared. The soldiers understood. None were to be spared. The work began with frightening precision. District by district, households were driven into the streets. Scholars, merchants, servants, men, women, children were separated only by convenience of counting. The Mongols had long perfected their arithmetic of vengeance. Each company was assigned a quota. 10 soldiers, 100 executions. 20 men, 200. They used cords to mark every 10th prisoner to keep the numbers clear. When the cords ran out, they used blood as ink. Some begged, others cursed. Most were silent. In the courtyard of the great mosque, bodies were stacked in squares, head to toe, like bricks for a wall that would never stand. At the well of Khosrow, the water turned opaque with silt and flesh. A rider rode his horse through it to test the depth. It reached the animal's knees. He nodded once and rode on. A group of Mongol officers gathered near the governor's mansion. The air there was almost clear of smoke, the marble still white beneath the soot. They unrolled maps, calculated remaining quarters to be purged, then divided the city into zones of completion. They spoke in low tones, their words dry, practical. One of them wiped his blade clean on a torn prayer rug and asked how long the widow wished the cleansing to continue. The answer returned from her herald, until nothing speaks. For 3 days and nights the noise never ceased. Not the screaming that burned itself out, but the steady thud of work. Axes splitting doors, buckets of pitch pouring onto thatch, horses snorting, drums counting time. When the last cry faded, the city lay like a field after harvest. Then came the burial, or what passed for it. To prevent disease, the Mongols ordered the corpses heaped into mounds outside the walls. Prisoners were forced to dig until their arms failed. Those who slowed were thrown in to join the rest. Chroniclers later argued about the number. Some said 90,000, some said more than 100,000. The figures blurred into legend. What mattered was that no one alive in Nishapur could dispute them. On the 4th morning, the wind rose from the east and carried dust over the plain. The widow walked among the mounds. Her veil fluttered against her mouth, but she did not cover her eyes. A scribe followed at a distance, recording the event for the Khan's archives. She paused before one heap larger than the others and spoke softly, the words lost in the wind. The scribe wrote only one line, "Here ended Nishapur." By evening, the Mongols had finished their recounting. The banners were lowered, the troops recalled, the campfires lit beyond the ruins. What remained of the city smoldered, walls cracked open, minarets half-standing, streets glazed into glass where heat had melted sand. When night fell, wolves began to howl from the foothills, drawn by the scent. No one stopped them. Far away in the royal camp, Genghis Khan received the report. He listened without expression, then dismissed the messenger. In his tent, the lamps flickered. He stared at the map before him, at the blank space that once bore the name Nishapur. Slowly, he took a brush and drew a single black line through it. The silence that followed was heavier than any roar of battle. The storm of the steppe had done what it was born to do, erase. When the last Mongol banner disappeared over the horizon, Nishapur ceased to be a city. It was a wound carved into the earth, black, hollow, and steaming under the morning sun. Nothing moved except the wind, and even the wind seemed afraid to stay long. In the days that followed, the smoke lingered over the ruins like a funeral shroud. From a distance, travelers on the caravan road thought they were seeing fog or mist, until the smell reached them. Horses recoiled. Birds circled high above but would not land. The air itself had turned bitter. Those who dared to cross the plain spoke later of a silence so complete it pressed against their ears like water. The Mongols had left behind no monuments, no written warning, only the mounds. Great hills of ash and bone outside the eastern gate, so large they changed the shape of the landscape. From far away they looked like dunes, but up close one could still see fragments of cloth, a child's sandal, a bracelet melted into a fist of flesh. The ground was slick with fat that had cooled in the night. A few survivors crawled from cellars and wells days later. They were not people anymore, just shapes in rags, coughing soot, their eyes reflecting nothing. They wandered among the ruins, calling names that no one answered. Some found their houses by habit, sat among the ashes and waited for something to happen. Others walked until they collapsed. In the chronicles they are not counted. They simply existed, then vanished. When word of Nishapur's fate reached the neighboring towns, Tus, Herat, Merv, disbelief came first, then dread. Rumors moved faster than riders. One said the Mongols had filled the city with smoke until everyone suffocated. Another swore they had cut the tongues of poets so no one could describe what they saw. Some whispered that Genghis Khan had commanded the earth itself to swallow Nishapur whole. None of it was true, but none of it was false enough to comfort anyone. At night, the desert wolves came. They moved through the outer districts quietly, avoiding the fires that still burned. They dug at the mounds, pulling bones free, gnawing at them under the moon. Their howls carried far into the plains, a sound so constant that travelers began to mistake it for wind. The Mongols did not return to chase them away. The wolves were part of the aftermath, the cleanup that nature performed when humanity ran out of mercy. A chronicler named Juvayni would later write of Nishapur, "It was as if it had never been." His words were not metaphor, standing among the ruins. He found no streets, no walls, only heaps of brick fused into glass. The city had melted into the plain. The river that once ran clear beside it now stank of decay. Even the reeds had turned black. The survivors who escaped to Herat brought more than stories. They brought madness. One woman, her hair white from ash and shock, wandered into the marketplace screaming that she had seen her husband's head used as a lamp base. The merchants drove her away, but her words spread like plague. The name Nishapur became a curse, a word spoken only in whispers. Genghis Khan's daughter, the widow Kokochin, returned to her father's camp carrying silence with her. When she dismounted, the soldiers bowed their heads, not in reverence but in unease. Even the Khan's generals did not speak to her. She had ordered a city's extinction and watched it carried out with her own eyes. No one knew whether to fear her grief or her strength. That night, when she stood before her father, she did not kneel. She simply said, "He has been avenged." The Khan nodded once, and that was the end of the matter. No feast, no victory song. Only a new order issued to his scribes, that the punishment inflicted on Nishapur be recorded in the chronicles as divine retribution. It was not the Khan who destroyed Nishapur, he said. It was destiny, but destiny had a face now, and it looked like his. When the last Mongol banner disappeared over the horizon, Nishapur ceased to be a city. It was a wound carved into the earth, black, hollow, and steaming under the morning sun. Nothing moved except the wind, and even the wind seemed afraid to stay long. In the days that followed, the smoke lingered over the ruins like a funeral shroud. From a distance, travelers on the caravan road thought they were seeing fog or mist until the smell reached them. Horses recoiled. Birds circled high above but would not land. The air itself had turned bitter. Those who dared to cross the plain spoke later of a silence so complete it pressed against their ears like water. The Mongols had left behind no monuments, no written warning, only the mounds, great hills of ash and bone outside the eastern gate, so large they changed the shape of the landscape. From far away they looked like dunes, but up close one could still see fragments of cloth, a child's sandal, a bracelet melted into a fist of flesh. The ground was slick with fat that had cooled in the night. A few survivors crawled from cellars and wells days later. They were not people anymore, just shapes in rags, coughing soot, their eyes reflecting nothing. They wandered among the ruins, calling names that no one answered. Some found their houses by habit, sat among the ashes, and waited for something to happen. Others walked until they collapsed. In the chronicles, they are not counted. They simply existed, then vanished. When word of Nishapur's fate reached the neighboring towns, Tus, Herat, Merv, disbelief came first. Then dread. Rumors moved faster than riders. One said the Mongols had filled the city with smoke until everyone suffocated. Another swore they had cut the tongues of poets so no one could describe what they saw. Some whispered that Genghis Khan had commanded the earth itself to swallow Nishapur whole. None of it was true, but none of it was false enough to comfort anyone. At night, the desert wolves came. They moved through the outer districts quietly, avoiding the fires that still burned. They dug at the mounds, pulling bones free, gnawing at them under the moon. Their howls carried far into the plains, a sound so constant that travelers began to mistake it for wind. The Mongols did not return to chase them away. The wolves were part of the aftermath, the cleanup that nature performed when humanity ran out of mercy. A chronicler named Juvaini would later write of Nishapur, "It was as if it had never been." His words were not metaphor. Standing among the ruins, he found no streets, no walls, only heaps of brick fused into glass. The city had melted into the plain. The river that once ran clear beside it now stank of decay. Even the reeds had turned black. The survivors who escaped to Herat brought more than stories. They brought madness. One woman, her hair white from ash and shock, wandered into the marketplace screaming that she had seen her husband's head used as a lamp base. The merchants drove her away, but her words spread like plague. The name Nishapur became a curse, a word spoken only in whispers. Genghis Khan's daughter, the widow Kokochin, returned to her father's camp carrying silence with her. When she dismounted, the soldiers bowed their heads, not in reverence, but in unease. Even the Khan's generals did not speak to her. She had ordered a city's extinction and watched it carried out with her own eyes. No one knew whether to fear her grief or her strength. That night, when she stood before her father, she did not kneel. She simply said, "He has been avenged." The Khan nodded once, and that was the end of the matter. No feast, no victory song. Only a new order issued to his scribes, that the punishment inflicted on Nishapur be recorded in the chronicles as divine retribution. It was not the Khan who destroyed Nishapur, he said. It was destiny. But destiny had a face now, and it looked like his. News rode west on 100 saddles, and none of them needed spurs. Messengers changed mounts in the dust of caravanserais, splashed their faces at cracked basins, and galloped on with eyes that would not meet anyone else's. In khans and markets, the story repeated so often it seemed rehearsed. Nishapur had been opened like a vein and left to bleed into the earth. The streets were crushed glass, and the wells were grave mouths. The Mongols did not take prisoners because there was nowhere left to put them. People leaned closer, asked for details, then flinched when they heard them. They slept with lamps burning and woke shaking anyway. In Tus, the elders met beneath a cedar that had outlived dynasties. They spoke of tribute, of surrender, of flight. Every plan ended with the same obstacle. Where could they go that horses could not follow? The men who had laughed at tales of Bukhara and Samarkand had nothing to say now. They picked at their sleeves until the seams frayed. When a scout returned from the east with ash ground into his beard like powder, he said only, "Do not wait." No one asked him to explain. In Herat, scholars argued the mathematics of survival. If a city gifted grain, carpets, coin and hostages, would the Khan accept it? If the gates were opened and the citizens knelt with ropes around their necks, would mercy be granted? Someone produced a copy of a decree from another conquered place, promising safety to those who submitted. Another man set it gently in the brazier and watched the edges blacken. "Paper cannot ride," he said, "and it cannot kill a memory." Outside, women who had once bargained over glass bangles now traded bread for knives. Along the Oxus, the river towns listened for hoofbeats, the way sailors listened for thunder. Ferrymen slept with their poles in hand. Families tied valuables into cloth bundles so tight the knots bruised their fingers. When the sun went down, every door seemed to breathe. In the dark, fathers told their sons a new catechism. If riders appear, you do not shout. You do not stare. You step out with empty hands. If they ask for water, you pour until the skin runs dry. If they ask for your name, you speak it once. If they ask for your son, you do not bargain, because a bargain means they will count. Letters crossed deserts on the backs of men who had no more letters left inside them. They arrived with the dust, brittle, stained, heavy with the weight of what they carried. Some warned neighboring princes not to gather armies in the open. The Mongols fed on formations like wolves on lambing fields. Some begged for alliance and received answers that were prayers disguised as politics. One emir promised reinforcements and sent none. Another offered refuge to refugees and closed his gates when he saw how many came. Cities had always betrayed each other. Now they learned how quickly betrayal ripened into annihilation. The rumor that the widow had commanded the extermination herself grew teeth. Mothers told their daughters not to sing in the courtyards at dusk, in case the sound traveled to the steppe. Men left their turbans unstarched, their boots unpolished, as if plainness could blur them in the eyes of fate. A caravan master swore he had seen a column of riders pass through a village without stopping. And yet, when he returned the next week, nothing stood there but a single doorframe. He dreamed of that doorframe for the rest of his life. He never walked through any door without touching the lintel twice. In the courts of the surviving Khwarezm princes, courage and cowardice changed clothes by the hour. Councillors laid out maps with trembling fingers, traced routes of retreat, circled fortresses that had never been tested. "Walls are a language they do not speak," one general insisted. Another shook his head. "They speak all languages," he said. "They make the grammar out of fire." When word came that a town had surrendered and been spared, a cheer rose. When 2 weeks later word came that the same town had been culled for rebellion, the cheer curdled into a silence no musician could break. Pilgrims went on foot to shrines that had not yet fallen, leaving offerings of bread and hair. The custodians burned incense until their eyes watered. They told the faithful that God's mercy was larger than any horseman's shadow. The faithful nodded and left with their mouths set in lines that did not look like peace. Faith endured, but faith walked faster when fear kept pace beside it. And through it all, the Mongols moved as if the world were a measured field. Scouts tasted soil for moisture, lifted grasses to read wind, counted stars to time a night march. Where the land was empty, they left it empty. Where the land was full, they made room. No manifestos, no charters, only the arithmetic of obedience. To those who had built their lives on words, contracts, poems, decrees, this new mathematics felt like drowning in clear water. You could see the bottom, and you could not reach it. One evening, as dusk painted the sky with the bruised colors of old fruit, a rider from Nishapur's outskirts reached a village by the foothills. He spoke slowly, like someone relearning a language. He described the counting, the mounds, the way the drums had turned men into numbers and numbers into silence. He said the wolves were not the worst of it. The worst was the wind lifting ash from the heaps and carrying it over the ruins, like a second burial, again and again, as if the city were being erased each hour anew. The villagers listened until the lamps guttered. Then they rose without speaking and began to pack. By the time the stars were full, the roads had become threads pulled from a cloth, unraveling toward the horizon. Behind them, the loom was in motion. Ahead of them, nothing was certain but the sound of hooves somewhere they could not yet hear, and the knowledge that when the sound arrived, it would already be too late to decide what to do. The months after Nishapur were not measured by calendars, but by distances from its ruins. Every village began to count its days in how far away the Mongols still were. 50 leagues meant time to pray. 30 meant time to hide. 10 meant the end of time. Along the caravan routes, the earth itself seemed to whisper what had happened. The tracks of wagons that once carried silk and spice were now ruts filled with ash. Crows followed the routes the way traders once did, circling the crossroads, waiting for what the wind might uncover. When riders appeared in the east, any riders, whole towns froze. Shepherds drove their flocks into dry riverbeds, not knowing that the dust clouds on the horizon were sometimes nothing but weather. The Shah's commanders sent scouts to verify the truth. Each time fewer returned. Those who did rode differently, slower, heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. They spoke of fields littered with arrowheads, of bones so clean the sun shone through them. In one abandoned mosque, a wall inscription had survived the fire. It read simply, "Remember what silence costs." The soldiers who saw it never entered another mosque again. Governors and emirs began to rule through fear before fear arrived. They hanged thieves on the city gates not for justice, but for demonstration. Proof that order still existed, that the people could punish themselves without Mongol help. The irony did not comfort anyone. Markets thinned, artisans fled, and the sound of hammer on anvil was replaced by the whisper of coins hoarded in cellars. The scholars of Merv, proud of their libraries, debated whether civilization itself could die. One quoted Aristotle, another wept. They spoke of empire as a cycle, of the rise and fall ordained by God. But beneath their words was a simpler terror, that words might no longer matter. One night, as wind rattled the shutters, a young scribe whispered, "What if Nishapur is what the world looks like when history stops?" No one answered. Pilgrims who reached the holy city of Mashhad brought handfuls of soil from Nishapur's outskirts. They poured it before the shrine and watched it scatter in the breeze, as if even the dust refused to stay. The imams called it a lesson, but the worshippers called it an omen. They began to dream of hoofbeats behind their prayers. To the east, the Mongols did not rest. Messengers rode to report the success to Genghis Khan, and from his camp, another wave of orders spread outward. Secure the roads, hunt the fugitives, prepare for Merv and Herat. The storm was not satisfied with one city. It moved by principle, not passion. Each victory was a calculation in a ledger only the Khan could read. Among the Mongol ranks, talk of Nishapur faded quickly. They spoke instead of horses, rations, rivers to cross. But at night, some still dreamed of the widow. They saw her standing on the mound, the wind tugging her veil, the sky turning the same color as the ashes below. When they woke, they rubbed their faces as if to wipe something off, but their palms came away clean. By the end of that year, every city west of the Oxus had learned the same lesson without being taught it directly. Surrender was no longer a strategy, only a delay. The Khan's reputation had become a weapon sharper than any blade. Mothers used his name to hush children. Generals used it to silence dissent. The idea of resistance rotted before it could bloom. And so fear became law. It traveled on every breath, signed no treaties, needed no translation. When the wind shifted from the east, men looked up instinctively. When horses neighed in the dark, they checked the horizon for fire. Nishapur was gone, but it had left behind something invisible and permanent, the knowledge that mercy had boundaries, and that the world had crossed them. That knowledge spread farther than the Mongols themselves. It rode the trade routes, settled in the corners of maps, whispered into the ears of kings who had never seen the steppe. In their dreams, cities burned quietly, and the sound of drums counted not years or months, but moments left before the next reckoning. The dust of Nishapur had barely settled when the next campaign began. For the Mongols, conquest was not a sequence of wars. It was a single motion that paused only to breathe. The riders who had burned one city simply turned their horses toward the next horizon, the ashes behind them still warm. What the world called slaughter, they called proof. Word of the massacre moved ahead of them like a herald. It crossed deserts faster than scouts could ride, carried by traders who thought silence would protect them, and by refugees who could not stop talking even in sleep. Every market square whispered the same question. If Nishapur could vanish, what hope do we have? Genghis Khan understood that fear was cheaper than siege engines. A city that surrendered before battle cost nothing to feed, nothing to burn. So he used Nishapur not only as vengeance, but as message. He let survivors, just a handful, wander west with stories that no exaggeration could improve. They told of pyramids of skulls higher than the city walls, of wells clogged with children, of the widow who watched without blinking. The Khan never corrected them. Rumor was a tool he sharpened carefully. When his generals gathered at spring camp near the Oxus, he listened without comment as they described the panic spreading through the Khwarezm lands. Governors were deserting their posts, tax collectors fleeing with their ledgers. Trade had stopped. The empire he had come to destroy was destroying itself. Only then did he speak. "The bow kills one man at a time," he said. "Fear kills multitudes." The next campaign was planned not as invasion but as demonstration. Columns were divided like fingers of the same hand, each moving along a separate road, but timed to arrive together, so that entire regions would feel surrounded before the first arrow flew. At night, the Mongols lit triple rows of campfires to make their numbers seem endless. Villages that saw the glow from miles away woke screaming, convinced that Nishapur had come for them too. Many opened their gates before dawn and waited on their knees, hands empty, faces pressed to the dirt. The Khan's commanders kept lists of towns that surrendered without resistance. Some were spared, their people left alive to spread tales of mercy, because mercy too could be weaponized. Others were wiped out anyway, so that surrender would never feel safe. No one could guess the pattern. That uncertainty was part of the plan. In Merv, the great oasis city, debate raged for weeks. Its scholars insisted that intellect could reason with the storm. The governor cited treaties, offered gifts, sent letters heavy with compliments. None were answered. When the first Mongol scouts appeared, the scholars climbed the minarets to watch, perhaps hoping for parley. From that height, they saw something new. Smoke pillars rising simultaneously on all four horizons. The army was everywhere at once. Across the plains, entire caravans abandoned their loads and scattered into the dunes. Merchants who had once haggled over silk now fought each other for water. Monks from the mountain monasteries fled with icons hidden under their robes. The Mongols did not chase them. The panic served its own purpose. Wherever they passed, they left behind no resistance, only rumor. Within months, Genghis Khan's influence reached cities he had never seen. Governors pledged allegiance through messengers. Fortresses surrendered to riders carrying only banners, no siege gear. Fear had become his second army, invisible but unstoppable. His chroniclers recorded each submission as a victory equal to any battle. The empire grew not by conquest alone, but by contagion. When summer came, The Khan ordered his men to rest the horses near the Amu Darya. The steppe grass waved waist-high, and for the first time in years, no drums sounded. But rest did not mean peace. His envoys rode out, carrying wooden tablets engraved with new laws. How much tribute each city would send, how its merchants would be taxed, how its sons would serve. Behind the numbers lay a promise no one dared test, the promise that Nishapur was only a beginning. By the time autumn touched the plains, the Mongol army had become less an army and more a law of nature. Wherever it appeared, the air changed. Traders spoke in whispers, dogs refused to bark, and the sky seemed to darken hours before dusk. The shadow of Nishapur had grown legs and was now walking across the world. Merv was the next to fall. The city had always been proud, vast gardens, domes that shimmered like copper under the sun, libraries filled with words so old that even their authors were dust. The Mongols arrived not with drums, but with silence. Scouts encircled the oasis at dawn, marking every well and exit road. By noon, riders were stationed beyond every gate, their horses stamping and snorting in the sand. The people gathered on the walls and watched them. They waited for the thunder of siege engines that never came. A single envoy rode forward carrying a black banner. He asked to speak to the governor. The governor descended to meet him, trembling but dignified. What passed between them was never recorded, but when the envoy left, the governor's face had turned grey. He climbed the tower of the mosque and shouted that the city must surrender, not tomorrow, not after negotiation, but now. The Mongols entered without resistance, disarmed the guards, and ordered everyone into the central plain for registration. Then, just as at Nishapur, the counting began. No one knows what word triggered it. Some said a soldier was attacked, others that the widow's order had become a standing decree. Whatever it was, Merv ceased to exist within a day. Chroniclers later claimed 700,000 were killed, perhaps exaggeration, but even half that number was beyond imagination. The Mongols burned the libraries last. They said the scrolls would make excellent fuel for the night fires. The ink turned the flames black, and the smoke smelled of parchment and time. When the reports reached Genghis Khan, he did not celebrate. He merely marked the outcome with a symbol on his map, a circle of ash. For him, the cities were no longer enemies. They were lessons. Everyone that burned taught the next what defiance cost. Fear was now policy, and policy was conquest. Herat followed. Its walls were thick, its people proud, its poets famous. The Mongols surrounded it, built trenches and waited. But the waiting was part of the design. Every day that passed spread panic deeper. Food dwindled, water ran low, and rumors grew fat. When the gates finally opened, the soldiers entered like tax collectors, counting, dividing, executing. The rest of Central Asia watched from a distance, frozen between disbelief and surrender. In the western deserts, refugees carried their grief like relics. They spoke of a time before the horsemen came, a time when cities glittered with lamps and the call to prayer echoed across the valleys. Now only the wind answered. Caravan routes that had once connected empires turned into graveyards of bones and broken wheels. The sound of bells from the camels was replaced by the hollow clatter of skulls caught in the sand. The Khan's empire grew on this silence. He built roads for his couriers, so news could move faster than resistance. He established postal stations, not for letters, but for orders. His generals ruled from tents, and his judges carried execution ropes instead of scrolls. The code, he wrote, the Yasa, demanded discipline, loyalty, and absolute obedience. It was said that under his rule, a woman carrying gold could travel from the Volga to China without being harmed. But the reason was not virtue, it was terror. No one dared to touch what belonged to the Khan. The Mongol banners became omens. To see one on the horizon was to feel the throat close, the knees weaken, the soul question whether prayer had meaning. Priests began preaching that the Mongols were a divine punishment, the hand of God correcting the sins of men. Even the scholars who once mocked superstition began to agree. How else could mere mortals do what they had done? In his later years, when Genghis Khan rode through the camp at night, he sometimes paused to look at the stars. He told his generals that the eternal blue sky had chosen him, that he was its instrument. But perhaps even he did not fully understand what he had unleashed. He had turned fear into a weapon sharper than any sword, one that needed no sharpening, no rest, no soldiers to wield it. Fear could travel alone, and so it did, through Persia, through Khorasan, across the Caucasus, and eventually into Europe. Wherever it went, people remembered Nishapur. The name itself became a ghost story whispered in markets, a lullaby that mothers sang to make their children behave, sleep, or the Mongols will come. From the steppe to the sea, the world bent under the weight of one truth. It is not armies that conquer, but terror that endures. Nishapur had been the beginning, the seed from which an empire of fear had grown, tall enough to cast its shadow over centuries. Long after the hooves had faded and the banners were nothing but tattered myths, the silence that followed the Mongols spoke louder than their armies ever had. The empire they built was still young, still growing, yet in its heart there lingered a question that none dared to voice aloud. What had they become? Even among the victors, sleep was not easy. The soldiers who had once galloped through fire now woke to the sound of nothing. No drums, no cries, only their own breath in the dark. They had conquered so completely that there was nothing left to fight, and in that emptiness, the ghosts of their deeds found them. Men began to dream of the cities they had erased. They saw the streets as they were before the fires, the lanterns, the laughter, the smell of bread at dusk. In the dreams, those people turned and looked at them, wordless, their eyes black with smoke. The warriors would wake with their hands clenched around their blankets, as if around sword hilts. Around the campfires, they rarely spoke of Nishapur. It had become a forbidden name, a thing too heavy for the tongue. When recruits asked what had happened there, veterans said only, "We did what we were ordered." But in their faces the truth still flickered, an unease that the steppe wind could not erase. Fear had served its purpose, but it had also infected its makers. Genghis Khan himself carried the weight differently. To his followers, he remained the storm-given flesh, unyielding, ordained by the eternal blue sky. Yet there were moments, brief as sparks, when even he looked inward. One night, after a campaign along the Caspian, he summoned his historian, a man named Shigi Kutuku, and asked him to read the latest records aloud. The scribe listed the cities taken, the tribute collected, the enemy generals executed. The Khan listened without expression. When the reading ended, he said quietly, "Write their names again, every man, woman, and child who lived in them. Then strike them through. Let the record show the price." The historian hesitated. "All of them, Great Khan?" "All of them," he said, "even those whose names are not known." The scribe worked through the night until his hands bled from the brush. In the morning, the Khan did not ask to see the pages. He simply burned them. The ashes drifted upward like a swarm of grey insects, scattering across the plain. "The wind," he murmured, "keeps better records than men." Beyond the empire's borders, the chroniclers who survived the invasions tried to rebuild the story of what had happened. They wrote by candlelight in ruined mosques, their ink mixed with soot, their parchment scavenged from the wreckage of libraries. They recorded the numbers, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and then abandoned numbers altogether. The scale of death had broken arithmetic itself. In its place they wrote parables of angels weeping, of the sky turning away, of the earth swallowing its own children. History became religion because reality could not be endured. Among the conquered, a strange kind of faith began to grow. Some believed the Mongols were the punishment of God, others that they were the test of faith foretold in scripture. Pilgrims carried bits of blackened stone from Nishapur as relics. They said whoever touched that stone would remember humility. But even humility turned sour. Men began to fear not sin but survival. To live when entire cities had died felt like theft. In Herat, years later, a scholar found a piece of pottery fused into glass by the fires of Nishapur. On its surface was a single word still legible in Persian: Zendegi, life. He placed it on his desk, stared at it for hours, and finally smashed it with his fist. He wrote in his journal that night, "Perhaps life itself is the enemy. Perhaps death was the truer mercy." His journal ended there, yet the empire kept moving. The Mongols expanded north toward the steppes of Russia and west toward the Caspian gates. The widowed princess Kokochin, who had once watched Nishapur burn, rode with them still. Time had hardened her grief into ritual. She never remarried, never smiled, never removed the black scarf that covered her mouth. Soldiers whispered that she had lost her voice when the last screams of Nishapur ended, that the silence itself had stolen it. Others said she had given her voice to the dead so they could speak through her dreams. At night she sat outside her tent, staring at the stars. One of her guards once asked what she saw in them. She replied, "Cities." He frowned, not understanding. "They look like cities," she said. Lit for a moment, then gone. As the years passed, the Mongol Empire stretched like a shadow over the earth, but the hearts of those who had built it grew hollow. Glory had come too easily, too completely. The men who had once lived for conquest now drifted through a world without challenge, their swords clean, their spirits unmoored. Victory had turned to rot in their hands. In the camps, the laughter of the younger soldiers felt forced, echoing too loudly across the plains. The old warriors, the ones who had seen Nishapur, who had crossed deserts filled with ghosts, sat apart. Their eyes were not on the horizon anymore. They looked inward, as if the enemy now lived there. Some began to drink fermented mare's milk until their hands stopped shaking. Others turned to shamans, asking if the souls of the slain could follow a man through dreams. The shamans said yes, and business was good. The generals tried to hide their fatigue behind ceremony. They spoke of destiny, of the eternal blue sky's command, but even their voices trembled at times. They had seen too much, and they knew that terror once unleashed does not always obey its master. It had begun to consume their sons, their daughters, their sleep. Children born in the aftermath of conquest played at sieges, stacking stones into miniature skull mounds. Mothers whispered prayers against nightmares that did not end when the sun rose. The Mongol Empire had forged peace through fear, but peace built from screams was never quiet. Genghis Khan aged like iron left in rain, still strong, but streaked with rust. His victories had made him a god in the eyes of men, yet the god himself began to dream of simpler things, the taste of goat milk, the smell of horses, the sound of his mother's voice. He would ride alone at night, far from camp, staring at the stars reflected in frozen ponds. Once a servant found him there and heard him whisper, "The sky is endless, but we are not." In his final campaigns, the Khan's orders became colder, cleaner, less human. There was no rage, no joy, only precision. Cities fell like dominoes. His sons executed his commands with mechanical obedience, never questioning, never understanding that their father had already begun to question everything. When envoys brought reports of fresh massacres, he no longer asked for numbers. "Enough," he said each time, "always enough." Chroniclers recorded that toward the end of his life, he forbade his men to speak the name Nishapur in his presence. He claimed it was superstition, that the name carried ill fortune. But those who had known him longest guessed the truth, that even the great Khan could not bear to look at what his own will had wrought. In private, he ordered that prayers be offered for the dead of every city his armies had destroyed. It was the closest thing to repentance a conqueror could allow himself. When he died in 1227, somewhere among the mountains of western Shia, the steppe itself seemed to hold its breath. His generals covered his body with felt and rode in silence toward the horizon, burying him in a secret place no one would ever find. Legend says that those who dug his grave were executed so none could reveal it. The river nearby was diverted to wash away all trace of his tomb. The water ran red for days, and when it cleared, not even a footprint remained, but his empire remained, stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian. from the forests of Siberia to the burning plains of Persia. It carried forward his vision, his discipline, and his shadow. In every city that heard the thunder of Mongol hooves, the memory of Nishapur rose again, an unspoken law that outlived its author. Generations later, when the empire fractured and the great Khans turned against one another, chroniclers would still write of that day in 1221 when the world changed. They called it the hour when fear learned to walk on its own. And somewhere beneath the dust of Khorasan, under fields that bloom red each spring, the bones of Nishapur still whisper to the wind. They say no empire, no conqueror, no god escapes the echo of what they have done. For even the most terrible storm leaves behind the silence that remembers it. Long after Genghis Khan's bones turned to dust, the name Nishapur still rode on the wind. It crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans, carried not by armies now, but by memory. The massacre had ended in fire, yet its echo lived on in whispers, in nightmares, in stories that refused to die. Every traveler who crossed the old trade roads of Persia knew to lower his voice when speaking of it. To speak too loudly was to invite the past to listen. In the markets of Herat and the mosques of Baghdad, merchants told stories of the Mongols to frighten children or humble the proud. Each telling changed the details. In one version, the Khan's daughter rode with the ghost of her slain husband beside her, a pale rider no one else could see. In another, the blood of Nishapur had turned the desert sand red forever, and flowers no longer grew there. Some swore the city's wells were still cursed, their water whispering in the voices of the dead. No one dared to test it. The scholars tried to record the truth, but truth had long ago become smoke. In Baghdad, Ibn al-Athir wrote of the Mongols with trembling hands. Such was the destruction that, if anyone were to say that since the creation of the world, men have not suffered anything like it, he would be speaking the truth. His ink dried into the paper like blood into linen. Others wrote more cautiously, afraid that to describe the Mongols too vividly might summon them again. They spoke instead in metaphors, storms, plagues, divine retribution. Yet even their poetry could not hide the fear. In Persia, entire generations grew up beneath the shadow of that memory. Fathers who had been children during the invasions told their sons that courage was folly. "The arrow that finds you," they said, "is the one you thought you could outrun." The Mongols had not only burned cities, they had burned ambition out of men's hearts. Where once stood grand academies and palaces, now stood silence. The people rebuilt, yes, but they built smaller, lower, as if not to offend the sky. Yet something else began to take shape in that silence. The story of Nishapur became more than a tale of terror. It became a mirror held up to humanity. Poets and mystics looked upon it and saw not only death, but revelation. The Persian mystic Attar, himself said to have died during the massacre, was remembered as a prophet of what came after, the annihilation of the self, the journey through destruction toward divine understanding. His poetry, rediscovered centuries later, spoke eerily of the fire that consumes illusions. "When the soul burns," he had written, "only truth remains." Some believed he had foreseen Nishapur's fate. As decades passed, the legend traveled westward. In the courts of the caliphate, nobles spoke of Genghis Khan as both monster and instrument of God. Preachers used his name in sermons as a warning to kings. When pride builds towers to heaven, the Mongol comes to bring them down. Even those who hated him admitted that the world after him was not the same. Borders had shifted, empires had crumbled, and faith itself had been tested. Out of the ashes of Nishapur and Merv and Herat rose a new kind of submission, not to man, but to fate. When Mongol envoys later rode to Europe, their reputation had already preceded them. In Venice, sailors whispered of the Tartars, horsemen who drank blood and turned rivers into bone. In the monasteries of France, monks copied tales of the East that mixed truth and nightmare. Some believed the Mongols were the armies of Gog and Magog from the Book of Revelation, breaking through the walls of the north to bring about the world's end. The more they feared them, the larger the legend grew. Centuries after the real city had vanished, maps still marked Nishapur with a tiny dot. But no one who drew those maps had ever seen it. It existed only in words now, and those words had become scripture. Travelers wrote that the wind over its ruins carried the faint smell of ashes, even in winter. They said the earth there was red as rust, and the stones whispered when stepped upon. Locals avoided the place after dusk, claiming that shapes moved between the dunes, carrying torches that never went out. The more time passed, the more the myth fed itself. A massacre had become a haunting, but even myths can teach. To rulers and generals who studied history, Nishapur was not just a warning, it was a lesson. The Ottomans, the Timurids, even later conquerors like Tamerlane studied Genghis Khan's campaigns. They learned that fear was the strongest currency of empire. Tamerlane, who admired the Khan above all men, would later build his own pyramids of skulls outside Damascus, declaring them monuments to discipline. He said he was following the wisdom of the great Khan. To make men obey, first make them remember. What none of them understood was that the Mongols had paid for that obedience with their souls. The strategy worked, but it left behind something hollow, something that echoed through generations. Conquerors, after Genghis, could imitate his victories, but they could never escape his silence. The legend of Nishapur was not merely a story of what the Mongols did. It was a prophecy of what power does to all who wield it too long. As centuries turned, the Mongol Empire dissolved into fragments, but Nishapur remained whole in memory. Its ashes became part of the world's collective conscience, a symbol too terrible to fade, too meaningful to forget. Even as new empires rose and fell, poets and rulers alike kept glancing backward, as if the ghosts of that city stood just behind them, watching. In Persia, storytellers no longer spoke of Nishapur with horror alone. They spoke of it with reverence, as if tragedy had sanctified the land. Travelers passing through Khorasan would pause on the barren plain where the city once stood. They would bow their heads, whisper a prayer, and scoop a handful of dust to carry home, not as a relic of war, but as a reminder of impermanence. The wind that moved across those plains carried more than sand. It carried philosophy. For the Persians, Nishapur became a lesson that all glory, even the glory of life itself, was fragile. Centuries later, Sufi mystics turned its story into parable. They said that Nishapur was not destroyed by the Mongols, but by its own pride, by forgetting the truth of humility. They taught that the fall of Nishapur was a reflection of the soul's journey. Only through annihilation could one reach understanding. In their gatherings, they repeated a saying that echoed like a prayer. To know the divine, you must lose everything human. In that sense, Nishapur's fire had burned away more than walls. It had stripped the world of illusions. Further west, in the courts of Europe, the Mongols became mythic figures. Chroniclers called them the scourge of God. Kings studied their tactics while priests studied their meaning. The name Nishapur appeared in medieval manuscripts, half-remembered, often misspelled, Nasapur, Naksapur, Nisabur, but always attached to terror. Artists painted scenes of faceless riders beneath red skies, and philosophers used the story to question divine justice. If God allows such things, one monk wrote, then perhaps we are not meant to be comforted in this world. By the Renaissance, Nishapur had become a metaphor. Writers used it to describe any act of destruction that seemed larger than comprehension. When plagues swept through Europe, they were called Nishapurs of the flesh. When cities burned, poets compared the smoke to that of Khorasan's lost jewel. The massacre had transcended time. It had become language itself, a word that meant the moment when civilization remembers how fragile it truly is. Even in Mongolia, where the Khan's memory was sacred, the tale was told differently. The storytellers around the steppe fires spoke of Nishapur not as triumph, but as sacrifice. They said the Khan had not destroyed it out of anger, but to teach mankind the balance of chaos and order. In their versions, the eternal blue sky had demanded one perfect city as offering, a city so beautiful that its loss would echo forever. Whether they believed it or not didn't matter. It allowed them to live with what their ancestors had done. Every empire, they said, must bury one truth so deep that no one can dig it up again. Nishapur was theirs. Modern historians would later try to count the dead, to separate myth from fact. They would trace the geography, study the soil, examine shards of pottery scorched black by fire. But even when the science was complete, when the archaeology had stripped away the superstition, something refused to die. The air over Nishapur still felt heavier than other places. Visitors spoke of an unexplainable quiet, a sense that sound itself was reluctant to stay. Some said the earth hummed faintly at night. Whether imagination or memory, no one could say. In the end, the true legacy of Nishapur was not its ruins, nor the Mongols, nor even the empire that had once stretched from sea to sea. Its legacy was the understanding that power, once absolute, devours itself. That fear, once unleashed, cannot be caged. That memory, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a voice. It whispers through centuries, changing shape, changing language, but never losing its core. It reminds every generation what it costs to believe that the world can be ruled by terror. And so, when the wind moves through the plains of Khorasan today, it carries with it 1,000 languages and one truth. The silence after the Mongols was never truly silence. It was the sound of history breathing, slow, patient, unending. Somewhere beneath that wind lies the dust of poets, warriors, mothers, and kings. And when the sun sets over the crimson earth, the shadows stretch long and thin, as if the dead of Nishapur are still standing, watching, waiting for someone to listen. The wind that once carried smoke from Nishapur would in time carry silk, spices, and ideas. Out of the wreckage the Mongols left behind, new roads were drawn across the bones of old kingdoms. They called it the Yam, a web of stations and relay posts that bound the continents together. What had begun as arteries for conquest hardened into veins of trade. The same hooves that had thundered for destruction now beat a rhythm for commerce. It was a paradox only history could invent. From the hand that raised the world came the hand that connected it. The Mongol banners still fluttered, but now they guarded caravans instead of catapults. Genghis Khan's descendants, Ogadai, Munka, and later Kublai, understood that fear could open gates, but wealth could keep them open. To rule an empire that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Danube, terror was not enough. They needed order, so the conquerors turned administrators. They standardized weights, repaired bridges, punished thieves as harshly as rebels. The Khan's couriers could ride from China to Persia in less than a month, each station stocked with fresh horses, food, and written commands sealed with iron authority. Along those same routes, traders followed. Persian glass, Indian gems, Chinese porcelain, furs from the north and from the far west, strange coins stamped with crosses. The world that had cowered before the Mongols now pulsed beneath their supervision, uneasy but alive. Yet the memory of fire never left. Every traveler who passed through Khorasan knew that prosperity had grown on scorched soil. In the rebuilt cities, merchants whispered prayers before opening their stalls. Poets thanked both God and fear for the peace that allowed them to write again. The people called it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, but peace under the shadow of the Khan was never gentle. It was the silence of a blade held steady at the throat of chaos. In the capital of Karakoram, stone replaced felt. Architects from Samarkand stood beside Chinese engineers, building temples, mosques, and shrines on the same street. The Mongols, once indifferent to religion, now gathered them all as if balancing the gods they had once offended. Buddhist bells rang beside the call to prayer, and Nestorian hymns mingled with shamanic chants. The empire had become a vast crossroads where even belief traded hands. But beneath the grandeur ran unease. The generals who had carved the empire feared softness. They watched their sons wear silk, drink foreign wine, and learn the languages of conquered peoples. What they had gained in wealth, they were losing in hunger. Old warriors muttered that the Khan's ghosts would despise the comfort of their descendants. "We have forgotten the cold," one veteran said. "Without the cold, the steppe will forget us." Still, the system worked. Roads remained safe, markets flourished, and emissaries from every corner of the known world crossed the steppes to bow before the great Khan. From Venice came Marco Polo. Dazzled by the order behind the savagery, he would later write of palaces that glittered, of cities reborn from dust. He never saw the ruins of Nishapur, yet its ashes colored every page of his wonder. The Mongol achievement, he realized, was built not despite the terror, but because of it. The destruction had cleared the ground for something new, and the fear of the past ensured obedience to the present. Even nature seemed to bend. Forests cut for siege engines gave way to open pasture. Deserts widened where irrigation had failed. The world was physically reshaped by conquest. And yet through that devastation, ideas traveled as never before. Paper-making, gunpowder, mathematics, astronomy, disease. The same roads that carried caravans also carried the plague that would later sweep through Europe, another invisible echo of Mongol expansion. History, as always, took its payment in balance. When Kublai Khan moved the imperial throne to China and founded the Yuan dynasty, the transformation was complete. The grandson of the destroyer became a builder of canals, patron of scholars, friend to traders. He ruled not by fear alone, but by curiosity. Yet even his court kept relics of the past. A bow of his grandfather's hung above the council chamber, its string never loosened. It reminded everyone that the empire's foundations were not stone or law, but the silence of conquered cities. And far away, across the deserts of Persia, the wind still carried dust from a place that no longer appeared on maps. When merchants felt the air grow warmer and the dunes redden, they knew they were passing near the bones of Nishapur. They would whisper a prayer, half in gratitude for the safety the Mongols had imposed, half in fear that safety could vanish as quickly as it had come. Time moved differently inside the Mongol Empire. Years passed like storms, sudden, loud, then gone, leaving the landscape altered but not healed. What the great Khan had built through terror and order now began to split along the same lines that once united it. The Mongols had conquered the world, but they could not conquer themselves. After Kublai Khan's death, the empire fractured like glass dropped from heaven. The steppe heart remained in the north, but to the west, new Khanates rose, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in the steppes of Russia, the Chagatai realm in Central Asia. Each claimed to speak in the name of Genghis, yet each dreamed its own dream. Brothers became rivals, cousins became kings. The horses that had once galloped in one direction now turned upon one another. With division came hunger for legitimacy. The Mongols had ruled through fear, now they sought to rule through faith. In Persia, the Ilkhan rulers converted to Islam, building mosques where their grandfathers had spilled blood. In the east, Kublai's successors embraced the ceremonies of Chinese emperors, wearing silk robes and speaking Mandarin. To the north, the Golden Horde adopted the traditions of the Rus, blending steppe and forest. Each branch believed it had found the true path, and in doing so, each drifted further from the other. The storm that had once moved as one became 1,000 scattered winds. But history has a way of remembering debts. The terror that had once enslaved the world returned home, quiet and patient. The Mongols had taught fear so well that even their own people began to live by it. Courts drowned in suspicion, alliances dissolved overnight, and Khans were poisoned in their tents by the very men who toasted to their health hours before. The empire that had thrived on discipline now feasted on paranoia. In the Ilkhanate, ministers argued whether God had punished their forefathers or blessed them. They rebuilt cities like Tabriz and Shiraz with marble and gardens, but in every courtyard stood statues of lions, their mouths open in eternal warning. Poets once again filled the bazaars, yet their verses carried an undercurrent of mourning. "We live," one wrote, in the peace of graveyards. The Mongols had unified the world through destruction. Their heirs tried to unify it through memory. But memory has teeth. By the 14th century, the descendants of the conquerors had become indistinguishable from the conquered. They married local nobles, spoke foreign tongues, and worshipped foreign gods. The once proud riders of the steppe now governed from palaces, surrounded by servants who bowed too deeply. The sons of Genghis Khan had inherited the world, but they had forgotten the steppe wind that had made them fierce. Without that wind, their spirit withered, and yet even in decline, their influence lingered. The trade networks they created still carried silk to Venice and gold to Beijing. The roads they paved still bore the weight of new empires. The terror they had unleashed had burned itself into the human soul so deeply that even peace bore its shape. Every kingdom that followed them, Timur's empire, the Ottomans, the Mughals, learned from their blueprint: rule swiftly, strike harder than your enemy believes possible, and build glory on the ruins of fear. In the end, the Mongol world collapsed, not in fire, but in silence, the same silence that had followed Nishapur. The last of the Khans were swallowed by the very lands they once ruled, their graves unmarked, their horses long gone. But across the deserts of Khorasan, when the wind howled, people still said it was the ghosts of the riders returning, searching for the home they could never find again. And somewhere beneath that same wind, the dust of Nishapur still stirred. It had witnessed both the beginning and the end, the moment terror was born and the moment it consumed its own maker. The empire of fear had built the world, and the world had buried it layer by layer beneath the weight of its own history. No monument marks where it ended, only the wind remains, moving endlessly over the bones of empires, whispering the same truth it whispered to the Khan centuries ago, that nothing built from fear can ever last, and nothing destroyed in anger is ever truly gone. When the dust finally settled over Eurasia, what remained of the Mongol world was not an empire, but an idea. It was an idea carved in both awe and terror, the knowledge that human will, when unchained, could reshape continents. Long after the last Khanate had crumbled, the world still moved in the pattern Genghis Khan had drawn with hoofprints and fire. The rivers of trade, the routes of war, the borders of kingdoms, all bore the faint geometry of his ambition. And yet, for every merchant who prospered along those roads, there was a ghost walking beside him. Every gold coin minted under a descendant's rule carried an invisible cost, the weight of the bones buried beneath the empire's foundations. The Mongols had done what no one else had. They had united the known world under one law. But the law had been written in ash. Historians centuries later would call it the Mongol paradox, that a people who destroyed so much had also created the first truly connected world. They burned libraries and then built postal systems. They annihilated cities and then opened the Silk Road to its safest age. They erased dynasties, yet in doing so, they cleared the way for new ones to rise. The Mughals in India, the Ottomans in Anatolia, the Ming in China. The world that followed the Mongols was a world born from contradiction, order grown from chaos, civilization rebuilt on the skeleton of ruin. The chroniclers of later centuries would argue whether the Mongols had been divine punishment or divine design. The Persians said they were God's whip, cleansing decadence from the earth. The Chinese saw them as a necessary storm that blew corruption from the court. The Europeans feared them as apocalypse and later studied them as teachers. Every civilization they touched absorbed a fragment of their ruthlessness and their discipline, a memory of what happens when willpower eclipses morality. In time, philosophers began to see Genghis Khan not just as a conqueror, but as a mirror held up to humanity itself. He was not a monster outside the world. He was the world stripped of its illusions. The same instincts that drove him, survival, pride, hunger, revenge, lived in every man, merely buried under thinner layers of civility. The Mongols had shown what mankind could achieve when those instincts were given command, and what mankind could lose when they were not restrained. Even centuries later, leaders would invoke his name when they sought to dominate, to unify, or to terrify. Napoleon studied his campaigns. Hitler admired his speed. Empires across time borrowed his strategies without admitting their source. To march quickly, strike decisively, rule through fear and reward. These became the grammar of empire long after his own had turned to dust. In that sense, the Khan never truly died. His empire simply changed its flags, but there was another legacy, quieter, heavier. The philosophers of Persia, the monks of Tibet, and the scholars of China all asked the same question in their own tongues: can peace be born from violence? The answer differed, but the doubt remained. The Mongols had proven that unity achieved through blood could last for generations, but not forever. They had shown that power without balance leads first to greatness and then to emptiness. In Nishapur, centuries after the massacre, the city rose again. Its new streets were narrower, its walls humbler, as if the earth itself had learned modesty. Poets returned. Merchants set up stalls where skulls had once been piled. And yet, even in rebirth, the air carried a strange stillness, as though the ground beneath remembered too much. Travelers wrote that the wind in Nishapur whistled differently than anywhere else, softer, almost reverent. They said it sounded like breath through hollow bones. The Mongols had never intended to leave philosophy behind them. But in their absence, philosophy bloomed like grass through cracks in scorched stone. People who had lived through the terror began to see existence itself as fragile and sacred. The poets of Khorasan wrote verses of impermanence, of fire and renewal. One wrote, "We are the cities of our own hearts. Build them wisely, or the Mongol within will return." The Mongol legacy, then, was not just empire. It was reflection, a mirror that humanity still cannot stop looking into. It forced the world to confront its own duality, that creation and destruction are not opposites, but twins, and that every civilization, no matter how advanced or moral, carries within it the seeds of its own Mongol moment, the point when control becomes conquest, when pride becomes punishment, when survival becomes sin. Centuries passed. The steppe winds that once carried the sound of hooves now carried the hum of engines and the static of radio. Yet somewhere in that new noise, the rhythm was the same, the steady, relentless march of expansion. The Mongol spirit had not died. It had simply changed its armor. What had once been empire was now industry. What had once been conquest was now progress. But the heartbeat was familiar. Nations still built their strength on speed, on obedience, on fear disguised as order. The roads once carved for horses became railways, then highways, then invisible data routes pulsing with information. The map of the world the Mongols had drawn through destruction became the nervous system of modern civilization. And just like the Khan's empire, it promised connection, but carried within it the shadow of control. The same questions whispered in the ruins of Nishapur still lingered in boardrooms and parliaments. How much can be taken before the taker is consumed? How much fear can be used before it becomes the ruler itself? Every age believes its power is cleaner than the last, but the dust of old empires disagrees. Modern man, surrounded by light and comfort, still dreams of the riders. The dream changes shape. Sometimes a storm of tanks rolling through desert heat, sometimes the glow of screens tracking unseen battles of influence and code. But the feeling is the same, a distant thunder that says, we have not changed as much as we think. Historians call the Mongols a product of their time. Philosophers call them a revelation of human potential. The truth lies somewhere between. They were humanity unmasked. They showed that under every civilization lies a hunger for unity that can so easily become a hunger for domination. Their empire, born in brutality, ended in bureaucracy, and that perhaps is the ultimate lesson, that even savagery seeks to organize itself. And still, the ghosts of Nishapur wander. They appear wherever ambition outruns compassion. They walk in every decision that values order over mercy, efficiency over soul. They stand behind every throne built on silence. The Mongol within us is not gone. It merely sleeps. It waits for the next empire that believes it can tame the world. When night falls over Khorasan now, the desert looks calm. The stars hang where the torches once burned. The wind moves softly through the plain, where a city once stood, carrying grains of red dust that glimmer faintly in moonlight. If you listen long enough, the air seems to breathe, a slow, patient rhythm, as if the earth itself remembers. The empire is gone. The conqueror is gone. The fear is gone. Only the memory remains, and the memory whispers, all empires fall. But the lessons they leave behind never sleep. The centuries that followed the fall of the Mongols did not begin with noise. They began with quiet, an emptiness where the thunder of hooves had once rolled. The steppe still stretched wide and endless, but now the wind spoke only to itself. The banners were gone, the drums silent, the riders buried. Yet the world they had changed still bore their imprint, as if time itself had been branded by fire. In Persia, fields slowly grew back over battle plains. The bones that had once marked the soil crumbled into dust, feeding the roots of wildflowers. Shepherds grazed their flocks where skulls had once been stacked into towers, and children played by rivers that had run red centuries before. Life, indifferent and persistent, returned. But it was a softer kind of life, one that moved carefully, as though afraid to wake something still sleeping beneath the ground. Travelers who crossed Khorasan wrote of an uncanny peace. The cities rebuilt after the invasion seemed older than their years, measured, deliberate, humble. Their mosques no longer reached for the heavens. Their domes curved lower, their towers bent toward earth, as if the people had learned that pride was the most fragile of all architectures. No one spoke loudly in the marketplaces. Even the laughter had an edge of restraint, the echo of centuries spent whispering for survival. In the heart of the former empire, nature began its slow reclamation. The old Mongol roads, once alive with caravans and riders, were swallowed by grass and sand. Wooden watchtowers fell, their timbers devoured by wind and time. The stone wayposts carved with the Khan's seal faded until they became indistinguishable from the rocks around them. What had once been the arteries of the world were reduced to ghost veins in the dust. And yet, in strange ways, the Mongol order endured. Traders still followed their routes, even if they no longer called them by name. Nomads still camped beneath the same stars, telling stories of the riders who had once conquered the earth. Those who had lived through the terror taught their descendants not hatred, but caution. The steppe remembers, they said, and the sky watches. Scholars in Samarkand and Bukhara began collecting what knowledge had survived. From fragments of Persian chronicles and Chinese records, they pieced together the vast story of conquest and consequence. They wrote not with anger but with awe. The Mongols had proved that history could move faster than men could imagine. They had shown that the world, like a single empire, could rise and fall as one. Their violence had knit continents together, but their silence afterward held them there. When night fell over the steppe, the stars returned with a clarity unseen in centuries. The air was thinner, the sky wider. Those who looked up at it saw not the gods of conquest, but the shape of eternity. They said the souls of the riders had joined the constellations, galloping forever across the dark. And somewhere among them rode the Khan himself, his eyes fixed on the horizon that no man could reach. Even in their absence, the Mongols remained a measure of human reach, a reminder of what happens when ambition outgrows compassion, and when the world is held too tightly by one hand. Their story lingered not in monuments, but in the rhythm of the wind, in the patience of mountains, in the whisper of grass bending beneath invisible hooves. Time moved forward like a slow tide, washing the scars from the land one grain of sand at a time. The world the Mongols had carved into motion gradually forgot the faces of its masters. Mountains eroded, rivers shifted course, and the names of once great Khans became uncertain sounds on the tongues of storytellers. Even the horses changed, smaller, gentler, their wildness bred out by centuries of peace. The silence that followed was not the absence of history. It was its echo. Empires never die suddenly. They fade, turning from thunder into memory, from memory into myth. The Mongol Empire had vanished, yet its pulse remained, buried deep in the earth, beating softly beneath every road, every border, every ambition that came after. In the monasteries of Tibet, monks chanted prayers over manuscripts rescued from the fires. They spoke not of revenge, but of impermanence. One verse read, "All power is borrowed, all kingdoms are guests." In the palaces of China, officials studying the old records of conquest began to mark the Mongol era not with hatred, but with curiosity. They catalogued it as a chapter of inevitability, proof that order and chaos are bound by the same thread. The Persians, once broken by the storm, found poetry in the ruins. From the ashes of fear rose new voices, Rumi, Saadi, Hafiz. They spoke of love, of humility, of the divine that survives all kings. To them, the destruction of Nishapur and the fall of empires were not ends, but purifications. "The fire burns," wrote Saadi, "until only truth remains." Their words carried across centuries, healing the wound the sword had opened. Farther west, Europe wrote the Mongols into prophecy. They became omens of judgment, horsemen of revelation, the embodiment of the world's reckoning. But as the centuries softened memory, even the West learned to see them differently. Historians began to understand that what had once seemed like chaos had been a force of connection. Without the Mongols, the world might never have learned to speak to itself. And so, as the ages turned, the shadow of the Khan transformed. He became not a figure of terror, but a question, one that every civilization still whispers to itself. What price will we pay for greatness? When dusk settles over the plains of Mongolia now, shepherds still light fires where the old camps once stood. The smoke rises straight into the dark, carrying the faint scent of salt and iron. They say that when the wind changes, you can hear a sound in the distance, a rhythm like hooves, soft, endless, fading into the horizon. No one fears it anymore. It is the heartbeat of history, the slow remembrance of everything that was and everything that will be again. And as the stars fill the night sky, bright and patient, they illuminate the same truth that outlived Nishapur, outlived Genghis Khan, outlived every empire that ever tried to hold the world in its hands. Nothing is eternal. Not cities, not kings, not even fear. Only the silence that follows remains, soft, steady, infinite. When history grows quiet enough, it begins to sound like breathing. Each century exhales its empires, its kings, its cities. Each new age inhales the dust and starts again. The world does not stop. It simply changes rhythm, as if resting between heartbeats. The Mongols had vanished, but the rhythm they set in motion continued. The caravans still moved slower now, more cautious. The old roads were quieter, yet their direction remained. Trade followed the same invisible lines, carrying silks and spices, but also stories. Stories that blurred truth and myth until they became one. Travelers told of a great conqueror who had ridden so far that even death had lost his trail. A man who ruled not for power, but for destiny. They spoke of Nishapur as if it were a wound on the world's body that had never quite healed. Night settled across the steppes the way it always had. Vast, patient, eternal. A shepherd tending his fire could look up and see the same constellations that once guided the Mongol riders across continents. The stars had watched everything, the rise, the flame, the silence. Now they hung above the earth like unblinking witnesses, shining with a calm that no conquest could touch. Beneath them, grass moved in slow waves, whispering secrets to no one. The scholars who came after wrote of the Mongols in tones half reverent, half weary. They no longer saw them as monsters or saviors, but as mirrors. They were the hand of time, one wrote, the wind that clears the old to make room for the new. Perhaps that was what history truly was. Not justice, not punishment, but a kind of sleepwalking through creation and destruction. The world dreaming itself into new shapes. In Nishapur, Where silence had once been a scream, people rebuilt again and again. Each layer of the city held the ashes of another beneath it. The foundations were thick with memory, but life returned anyway. Wells were reopened, markets rebuilt, prayers whispered under the same sun. The descendants of the survivors no longer told stories of vengeance. They told stories of endurance. The children who played among the ruins did not imagine Mongols. They imagined gardens. Time, in its quiet mercy, had begun to heal what history had shattered. And yet, even healing carried a shadow. The people knew, though they would not say it aloud, that what happened once could happen again. That somewhere in the long corridor of centuries, another conqueror would rise, different name, same hunger, and the cycle would turn again. Empires were not lessons. They were habits. Humanity, forever restless, could not resist building towers just to see how far they might fall. But perhaps that is why history, at its deepest, feels so much like sleep. We dream of greatness, awaken to ruin, then dream again. Every civilization drifts between waking and forgetting, between ambition and repentance. The Mongols were one dream, vast, violent, unstoppable. And now the world slept in the quiet they left behind, unaware that the next dream was already stirring somewhere beyond the horizon. And still the wind moved, tracing old paths invisible to the eye. It carried the dust of conquerors and the breath of poets alike, mixing them until they were indistinguishable. Every grain of sand that passed through a traveler's hand had once belonged to someone's story. A soldier, a child, a scholar, a king. The world had been built from their remnants, and it was still being built. Night deepened over the steppes. The fires that once marked armies now belonged to shepherds and wanderers, small lights scattered across the horizon. From a distance, they looked like stars fallen to earth, flickering in rhythm with the sky above. Between them stretched the dark silence of the plains, endless, patient, older than any empire. The world at last was resting. The wind that had once carried the scent of blood now smelled only of grass and smoke. It passed through the ruins of cities and over the graves of kings, brushing them all with the same indifferent touch. It did not remember names. It remembered motion. It had learned long ago that everything which rises must someday fall back into its current. And so it moved, eternal and unhurried, carrying the dust of Nishapur through centuries. Travelers who slept beneath that wind sometimes dreamed strange dreams. They saw endless riders galloping through clouds, faces hidden, banners streaming like shadows. The hooves made no sound, but the ground trembled. Then the riders vanished into light, leaving only the echo of their motion, the soft rhythm of the earth breathing in its sleep. When the travelers awoke, they could never tell if it had been a dream or a memory borrowed from the land itself. Historians would later call the Mongol Age a turning point. But the earth called it something simpler, a sigh. Every forest, every mountain, every river the Mongols had crossed now carried a trace of their passage, as if the planet itself had shifted slightly to make room for them. And in that shift, the modern world was born. From the ashes of destruction came connection, a network of roads and stories that bound humanity closer than before. The fire had not only consumed, it had forged. Yet, when the wind quieted, when the stars grew pale before dawn, one truth remained. The Mongols had proven what man could do, not what he should. Their legacy was not glory or empire, but awareness. Awareness of the fragile thread that holds civilization together. Awareness of how quickly it can be cut. They had shown the world that greatness is never gentle, and that peace is not the absence of violence, but the decision, repeated every day, not to return to it. And so, history closed its eyes. The steppe breathed slow and steady, like a giant animal finally at rest. The rivers ran quietly, erasing the prints of hooves. The ruins of Nishapur lay still under 1,000 stars. No songs rose from them, no cries, no prayers. Only the hum of the earth itself, the low vibration of time moving forward. If one stood there long enough, in that vast emptiness, they might feel it, the pulse of everything that had ever lived and died. moving beneath their feet, a reminder that even the most terrible storm is part of a larger rhythm, and that the silence which follows is not an ending, but a return. The past had gone to sleep, but the dream continued. There is a place between night and morning where history loosens its grip. Names grow light, dates float away like lanterns over water. In that place, a traveler may walk the plains of Khorasan and feel the ground breathing, slow, patient, forgiving. The cold has a kindness to it. The wind forgets to be cruel. Even the stars seem nearer, as if they have bent down to listen. The traveler sits beside a small fire and closes his eyes. He has read the chronicles, memorized the campaigns, traced the maps with a scholar's finger. But here, none of that matters. The plain does not remember numbers. It remembers footsteps, hooves, the warmth of bodies long gone. It remembers lullabies sung to children in houses that no longer stand. It remembers markets at noon, prayers at dusk, the smell of bread and dust. When the traveler breathes, he inhales all of it, victory and ruin braided together until they are indistinguishable. From this quiet, a story returns, not as a march of armies, but as a single human thread. A mother in Nishapur carrying water at dawn. Her hands are raw from work. She pauses at the doorway to watch her son sleep, his hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, his mouth open just enough to whistle. She has never heard of the man who will ride from the east. She only knows the color of the morning light on her child's face. The traveler sees her as if she stands across the fire, her eyes reflecting orange, and he understands. Every empire is built upon moments like this, unrecorded, fragile, holy. The fire settles, a log falls, sparks drift up, and the wind lifts them into constellations that last a heartbeat. The traveler thinks of the Khan, of the daughter who watched the city's end, of the generals who counted, of the scribes who tried to turn screams into script. They were not abstractions. They were people with sore knees and stiff backs, with calluses where their pens rubbed, with dust in their teeth. History hardens them into statues. The night softens them back into flesh. Somewhere in the darkness a herd moves. The sound is distant, a low hush like surf against a hidden shore. The traveler remembers how the Mongol armies moved, 10,000 hooves arranged into rhythm, a drumline of earth itself. That music once terrified the world. Tonight it is only the sound of animals searching for grass. The terror has gone out of it. The plain keeps the rhythm, but not the fear. He thinks of the paradox that littered every page he studied. The same hands that burned cities also raised roads, weighed coins, punished bandits, opened markets, protected caravans, carried letters from one end of the earth to the other. He sees how the world of his own day, its languages crossing borders, its goods passing from palm to palm, its ideas arriving before their messengers, grew from that contradiction. The traveler does not forgive it. He simply understands it. Understanding is quieter than judgment, and it lasts longer. The wind turns. In its change is a memory of winter rides, felt coats stiff with frost, breath clouding as a banner tips to catch the moonlight. The traveler imagines a boy soldier half asleep on his pony, head bobbing, cheeks chapped. He will wake at dawn to the smell of mare's milk and cold iron, then ride into a city whose name he cannot pronounce. Years later he will forget that name. He will remember only the ache in his thighs and the way the sun made everything look innocent just before it wasn't. The traveler feels a tenderness for that boy he does not expect. Pity is too small a word. What he feels is kinship with the part of the boy that wanted only to belong. A fox crosses the edge of firelight and stops, one paw lifted. It blinks, measures the human and passes on. The plain accepts the traveler the way it accepted the riders, the merchants, the widows, the wolves. Without ceremony, it has room for all of them and for the quiet that follows. The fox leaves no track the wind will not erase. The traveler hopes the same for his own footprints, to come and go gently, to disturb as little as possible. He takes from his satchel a scrap of paper and writes a single sentence. All power is borrowed. All life is on loan. He folds the paper and feeds it to the fire. The flame hesitates, then opens and takes it in. There is a lesson in the way the ash lifts, turns silver and vanishes. Not everything needs an archive. Some truths do their best work after they disappear. Far away, a village wakes. A rooster declares a kingdom of fences and roofs. Pots knock. Water spills. A door sighs on its hinges. The traveler hears it all from this distance, as if the plain itself were a choir rehearsing the morning. He realizes the world did not end at Nishapur. It never ends. It only changes whose breath warms it. Cities return with smaller voices. Children redraw streets with their feet. The great wheel turns, not toward justice or doom, but toward continuity. Against that wheel, terror is temporary. He lies back and watches the sky. The longer he looks, the less he sees stars, and the more he sees space. The deep, patient dark that holds their burning without comment. Empires are sparks inside that dark. Some are bright, some are brief, none are the sky. The traveler lets that thought settle in his chest until his heart matches the slow pace of it. The night no longer feels cold. It feels exact. Somewhere a dog barks. A second answers and then thinks better of it. The traveler smiles. He thinks of how the chronicles recorded drumbeats and decrees, not dogs changing their minds. He wonders what else the books couldn't carry, the way grief smells after rain, the texture of soot on a child's palm, the kindness of a stranger who says nothing and pours you tea. The plain remembers these things. Perhaps that is why it feels like a book being written as you walk across it. The wind settles again. The world becomes a bowl of silence, and the traveler a stone at its center. He closes his eyes and sees not battles but thresholds. Gates opening, doors closing, borders dissolving into dust. He understands that endings are simply places where breath pauses. He waits for the next inhale. It comes as dawn, almost invisible, blue lifting the black, shapes returning from their hiding places in the dark. The traveler sits up, stiff but rested. The fire is white embers now, warm as bread. He cups his hands to it, and in the small heat he feels something like absolution. Not for the dead, not for the living, but for the world itself, which keeps trying. He stands, brushes ash from his coat, and turns toward a road he cannot see but knows is there. He walks, because walking is what the plain taught him. Behind him, the wind takes his seat by the ashes. Ahead of him, morning keeps its promise. Water. The horizon glows faint gold, and for the first time in what feels like forever, the world looks simple. The traveler walks, his boots whispering through grass that has grown from centuries of ash. Each step feels light, as if the earth has forgiven him for remembering too much. He passes a single stone carved with words worn thin by the wind. He can read only fragments. Time. Mercy, return. It is enough. He bows his head and keeps walking. The air tastes of dust and salt. In that taste, he can almost hear the ocean, though it lies 1,000 miles away, because memory travels farther than sound. Villages wake fully now. Smoke threads into the sky, the color of old parchment. Children chase goats between fences. Their laughter skips like pebbles across water. No one here fears riders from the east anymore. The stories have aged into lessons, and the lessons into lullabies. The Mongols are now figures in bedtime tales, riders of the sky, teachers of fate. Time has done what even the fiercest armies could not. It has turned terror into wisdom. At the edge of one village, the traveler pauses to watch a woman drawing water from a well. The bucket creaks, the rope hums, the sound echoing down into the earth's throat. When she turns, she smiles at him, an ordinary smile, small and unguarded. It carries more grace than all the empires he has studied. He realizes then that civilization begins exactly here, not in conquest, not in kingship, but in the quiet exchange between strangers who mean no harm. He continues on, following a path of packed earth that might once have been a royal road. It leads him past the remains of an old caravanserai, arched gateways, stone courtyards overrun with grass. A lone tree grows through the center of what was once a market hall, its branches reaching toward the light that spills through the broken roof. Birds move among the leaves. Their wings flash silver in the sun. Life has returned to what death abandoned. He stops beneath the tree and sits. Around him, silence folds itself neatly, like a cloak being set aside at the end of a journey. The traveler feels the weight of centuries resting on his shoulders. Not heavy, just real. It is the same weight that all who remember carry. He wonders if the Mongols, in their last moments, had felt something similar. That strange mixture of triumph and emptiness. That realization that the world continues even after you have conquered it. The traveler closes his eyes and listens. The sounds blend into one another. The hum of insects, the rustle of wind, the faint laughter of children in the distance. It could be any century. Perhaps it is. Time, after all, is a circle too large to see. What was once ruin is now rhythm. What was once fear is now the heartbeat of the earth. He breathes slow and deep. He feels the dust of Nishapur in the air, in his lungs, in his blood. It no longer frightens him. It feels like belonging. The dead are not gone. They have become the ground that carries him forward. In this understanding, grief softens into gratitude. The past does not demand tears, only remembrance. Above, clouds drift lazily, forming shapes that the mind half recognizes. A bow, a horse, a flame. They shift and fade, replaced by others. The traveler watches until he can no longer tell where memory ends and imagination begins. Perhaps they are the same. Perhaps all of history is simply the earth dreaming of itself. He lies back against the roots of the tree and lets his eyes close. The warmth of the sun settles over him. He feels his heartbeat slow, matching the rhythm of the land. The last thing he hears before drifting into sleep is the wind moving through the branches. The same wind that once carried the hooves of 1,000 riders, now reduced to a whisper. It says nothing of conquest, nothing of ruin. Only this: rest, the world remembers for you. And somewhere in the distance, the plain exhales. Night gathers like a careful curator, dimming the lamps one by one until the world becomes a single room. In this room, the exhibits are not artifacts, but moments. Quiet, ordinary, almost invisible until you stand very close. A bowl set to dry on a windowsill in Nishapur. A boy's sandal turned sideways near a doorway. A scrap of calligraphy, the ink gone brown, reading only, "Be kind." None of these survived the fire. And yet here they are, arranged by memory, lit by the patience of centuries. You enter this museum without feet. The floor is the plain itself, cool and vast. The walls are the horizon. The ceiling is the sky deciding to become night. The docent is the wind. It speaks in a language older than conquest, guiding you through displays that no hand could assemble. First it shows you a street at dusk, the color of pomegranates and smoke. Then a courtyard, where water once laughed against a stone lip. Then the threshold of a house, smoothed by generations of palms. Each scene is complete without people, the way a book can still be a book after its reader has gone to sleep. The wind gestures toward a case that holds nothing but light. Inside that light you glimpse a sequence. Riders far away, banners low, the sun behind them. No sound, no drums. The silence is the artifact. The silence is the proof. You realize that the terror of the Mongols is now most terrifying for what it leaves out. The noise removed, the screams withheld, the forbidden mercy of quiet. We are trained to fear thunder. We seldom fear the moment after, when the air pretends nothing happened. Further on, the museum opens into a hall of breath. 1,000, 10,000 breaths all at once, in and out, a tide of human being. Mothers, soldiers, scribes, bakers, thieves, saints. Their breaths overlap until they become a single ocean. You do not hear words, only the measure that words ride upon. Empires try to command this tide with oaths and banners. It never belongs to them. The hall teaches a simple truth. To rule is to forget that breath cannot be counted. You pause before a panel labeled arithmetic. It displays pebbles arranged into neat stacks, tens, hundreds, thousands. A placard beneath reads, "What we count becomes smaller than what we cannot." You think of the quotas at Nishapur, the mounds measured by companies, the cords tied around every 10th wrist. Numbers were the last language spoken there. After the numbers finished, the wind took back the conversation. The pebbles spill when you touch the glass, not in the museum, but in you. Another gallery, inheritance. Here are the roads the Mongols repaired, the posts of the yam, the scripts stamped into wooden tablets. Here is the quiet of a guarded caravan and the relief that follows a safe crossing. Here too is the plague, riding invisibly along the same routes. Connection is a double edge. It binds trade and terror, mercy and mistake. The exhibit asks no question and answers none. It merely places two mirrors face to face and lets you walk between them. In a side alcove, you find the widow's seat, a simple saddle on a low rise of earth. No plaque, no legend, only a hollow worn by the weight of someone who once did not blink. The air is cooler here. You sit and find that your back straightens on its own. A thought arrives uninvited. Justice tastes like iron when it is boiled too long. You rise, not out of judgment, but because the saddle remembers a grief larger than one lifetime can hold. From here, the museum narrows into a corridor of doors. Each door is a city: Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Herat. Some open to gardens and lanterns, some open to ash. You reach for Nishapur and find no handle at all. The door is simply not there, only a frame and the night beyond. You step through anyway and discover a courtyard of stars. A fountain stands at its center, dry but clean, as if prepared for water that will never come. You kneel and put your hands on the rim. The stone is colder than truth. Now the docent wind brings you to the final chamber, where the exhibits are not moments but principles. Impermanence stands beside responsibility. Power leans against mercy and listens for a heartbeat. Fear sits alone, polishing a dull blade that is still sharp enough for mirrors. Memory watches you enter and smiles. Not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. It has seen your face before. On generals and poets, on widows and kings, on boys learning to tie a knot. Memory says nothing. It never has to. A bell you cannot see marks the hour. The Museum of Night begins to close. Lamps fold into themselves. Labels fade to simple color. The wind thanks you without words and escorts you back to the threshold. Before you leave, you glance behind you and notice that where the exhibit stood, there is now only plain. Grass, dust, distant lights. The museum is not a place. It is the way night arranges what day cannot bear. You step outside and the door becomes air. A fox crosses the path with the serenity of something that cannot be conquered. Far off, a dog changes its mind twice before barking. The sky lowers its voice until stars can be heard. All around you, the world settles into its true shape. Not war, not peace, rest. You understand then why history makes us sleepy at the edge of truth. It is not boredom, it is surrender. The body learning again how to be carried by time instead of trying to carry it. The plane takes your weight without complaint. Your heartbeat meets its hum, and for a moment the two are the same note. You lie down, not to forget, but to remember differently. You rest there on the threshold between story and sleep, and the museum fades until only the air remains. The wind that once guided you now moves through the grass, patient as breathing. It carries no words, only warmth, the soft exhale of the world remembering itself. Above you, the sky begins to pale. The first light of dawn touches the horizon, and for a moment, the stars linger reluctant to leave. They have watched everything, fire and empire, grief and rebirth, and yet they look unchanged. Perhaps they too have learned the lesson of the plain, that all things pass, and passing is not the same as ending. The ground beneath you hums. It is the pulse of the earth, slow and even, the sound that existed before conquest and will exist after memory. The dust of Nishapur, the ashes of cities, the breath of the living, All of it drifts together, indistinguishable. You realize then that history is not a straight line, but a circle. A great wheel turning endlessly. Each spoke a lifetime. Each rotation another chance to begin again. The wind sighs, and in that sigh are all the voices of the past, whispering not of vengeance or victory, but of rest. The warriors who once galloped through fire have dismounted. The widows have unbound their hair. The scribes have put down their pens. The empire that dreamed of eternity now dreams of silence, and you too are part of that silence. You are lying within it, breathing with it, carried by the same rhythm that moves mountains and seas. The world turns beneath you, steady and forgiving. The wars have ended. The fire has cooled. The plain at last sleeps. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a child will wake and chase the dawn. A merchant will open his stall. A poet will lift his pen. Life will go on, unaware perhaps that it is walking on the dust of kings. But that is how it should be. History's purpose is not to chain the living to the dead, but to remind us that all of it, even the terror, was part of the same great breath. The last of the stars fades. The plain glows with morning light. The wind folds itself around you, warm as a blanket. And just before sleep takes you fully, you hear it, the faintest whisper, as if from the lips of the earth itself. Rest. The storm is over. The world remembers. And then there is only stillness, only peace, only sleep.